when you live in a relatively homogeneous, small society, one can rely upon general agreement as to basic conceptions of the good, right? So you can rely in an ancient Greek city-state that people are going to roughly share a basic conception of the good, what the virtues are, so to speak. In a larger, more pluralistic, more heterogeneous society, that becomes less and less likely. And so you begin to develop a picture of morality that is more akin to that of the law. Right?
Yes, that's right.
So that's one reason why you might deliberately narrow your ethics, and that is because you can no longer rely upon shared common assumptions about basic matters of value, which means basic notions of virtue. That's one reason. The second reason, and this is going to bring back something that we just talked about in the context of science, is that a virtue ethic of the sort that you have in ancient Greece relies upon a conception of the human purpose. Right.
Sure.
That is of there being a now we have no problem talking about human purposes at the level of the individual. I have all sorts of purposes in my life. You have all sorts of purposes in your life. Right. But to have a common notion of what a virtue is, that is what it means to flourish, not just as me or you, but as a human being, so that we can come up with some sort of general account, requires a teleological view of human nature. And even though biology retains a teleological conception of explanation, it does not retain the richer teleology of human nature that you find in ancient Greece.
Yeah, you're right.
Right, and so I guess I want to ask you, what do you think about those two? And with respect to the latter, how do you recover a virtue ethic in the contemporary framework without appealing to a notion of a purposeful human nature?
Right. No, those are excellent questions, and I'm sure there is, in fact, quite a bit right about what you said. But I'm going to sort of try to push back on in two or three different ways. So, first of all, we don't need, in order to recover a virtue ethical framework, we don't need to have a teleological version of human nature. Although you're right, that's precisely how the Greeks got there. We just need a conception of human nature. We just need to agree that there are certain things that are fundamental about being human that separate us, even statistically. I'm certainly not talking about essences. I'm a biologist. I don't believe in essences. But even so, statistically speaking, human beings are a particular cluster of characteristics that clearly separates us from anything else out there, including our close cousins, right? So I think that all one needs is a statistical clustering version of human nature in order to retain the basic idea behind virtue ethics. Now, that's the first point. The second point, which is related, is, as it turns out, there is empirical research on the so-called virtues. And I actually wrote about this in one of my blogs, How to Be a Stoic. .org, if people want to check it. And,
you have enough blog? Are you sure you have enough blogs, Massimo? Good grief! How do you keep track of all that?
I'm very well organized. But so there's some research within the field, the subfield of psychology, which is often referred to as positive psychology. Which is an interesting field. It's got its own problems because people sometimes push too much. This idea of positive psychology becomes almost sort of a trivial self-help kind of thing. But the basic idea of positive psychology, of course, is that I think it's sound, and it is that psychology, for almost from the beginning, has focused on what happens when something goes wrong with the human mind, and not what happens to normal human beings who are not, in fact, depressed or don't have serious problems. Most human beings are not don't fall into the pathology, into psychological pathologies. And so, positive psychology is about figuring out what empirical science can tell of useful to people who have normal problems or normal range of problems in normal lives. Now, one of the subtype of research in positive psychology has to do with this idea of the virtues, because positive psychologists talk a lot about eudaimonia. They have adopted the term from the ancient Greek terminology, so the eudaimonia meaning the good life, the life that is worth living, that sort of stuff. And they have actually done comparative cross-cultural research. where it turns out that basically every society they looked at does have a concept of virtue. And although there are differences locally, there are some virtues or some definitions of specific virtues that pop up in one culture but not in another. And also there are some kinds of virtues, some types of virtues that are more important, considered more important, more fundamental in some cultures rather than others. Turns out that there is a basic set of, I think it's, if I remember correctly, it's about 6 different virtues, and we can link to the essay that I'm talking about so that people can go and check them out. And those 6 are in fact present in pretty much every society they looked at. That seems to me to suggest that there is in fact a common understanding, a common ground, a human flourishing that can work in a pluralistic society, with certain adjustments, of course, with the proviso, as we said, that this whole thing doesn't come out of any strong notion of teleology or anything like that. It just comes out of the fact that human beings, evolutionarily speaking, happen to have developed a certain kind of needs and certain kind of basic psychology. So there's those 2 issues that I think speak in favor of a resurgence of virtue ethics. But there's a third one. I like your pointing out these turn toward deontological systems or toward utilitarian system, in other words, toward sort of top-down ethical systems, essentially, the universalist ethical systems, once we get to large societies. Fine. But you also mentioned the law, right? And so the ancients already had a fairly large and, in fact, culturally diverse society. I'm not talking about
you're talking about the Roman Empire.
Exactly. I'm not talking about Athens, but rather the Roman Empire, where people were from all over the place. I mean, for instance, as you know, I'm into Stoicism, and I often refer to the 3 major Roman, quote-unquote, Stoics, Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. None of the 3 was actually Roman. Seneca was from Spain, so was Marcus Aurelius, and Epictetus was from Greece, in a part of Greece at the time that now is modern-day Turkey. So none of them actually was Roman. They were very different from each other. They came from very different backgrounds. So the Romans had to deal with this kind of large, multi-ethnic, multicultural society, and yet for a millennium, they found a way to actually deal with it in a somewhat positive way. I mean, I don't want to eulogize the Roman Empire.
Right. But that was partly because the actual law that covered the entire empire was relatively minimalistic. And pretty much they left you pretty much to your own devices. I mean, unless you were as annoying as my people were.
Exactly. Your people were...
And really sort of pushed it in the public and refused to sort of obey certain public niceties. You were pretty much left to do what you like. I mean, the Persians sort of managed their empire in a similar way. So you really could argue that, in a sense, there was a sort of local ethos, which you could say was sort of virtue-based, and then there was a superstructure of imperial law that really didn't get into much that we would call moral or ethical, and had to. In other words, the virtues in Rome might be very different from the virtues in Britannia and the fringes of the empire amongst the Celts or whoever it was that they were ruling over nominally. And so is that really an example of... Is that really a good analogy for a nation state in which you have these diverse populations within a single country in which the law isn't just... The laws can't just be sort of these minimalistic... We can't allow such enormous differences in ethos between, let's say... I mean, we see in our own country the strain that causes, right? When you have such a fundamentally different ethos, let's say... where in my part of the country where I live and in the part of the country that you live, causes tremendous conflict, right?
Sure. No, that's absolutely true. But actually, if you don't mind, before we go back there...
we're not going to talk about Trump, I promise, right? That's what I was thinking of in terms of a rule of morality, maybe as a way to try and minimize those kinds of conflicts, right? And say, look, we really can't leave things to local ethos anymore. We're one country, we're one...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, it would be sort of foolish to say let's pick the Roman Empire or the Persian Empire or the Chinese Empire. By the way,
Because,
in the Chinese Empire, that's where we got the development of Confucianism, which is actually a type of virtue ethics. itself.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah,
it's a very similar, in fact, to sort of an Aristotelian approach with different emphasis on different aspects of the human condition. But no, the idea isn't sort of naively to say, well, look at what the Romans did and just translate it into modern society. That would be crazy. Although, if you look at this recent book on the history of Rome, simply entitled SPQR by Mary Beard, who is a prominent international scholar of ancient Rome, she wrote this book explicitly because she thinks that there are actually a number of lessons that we can still get from the Roman Empire and sort of that might make us think in a more creative and more interesting way about our own problems. She says very interestingly, for instance, that often people write about the Roman Empire in terms of, let's say, its military might, right? As if modern generals could somehow take a page from the rule book of Julius Caesar. And she says that's just crazy because the conditions, the technology has changed so much and the conditions on the ground are so different that it would be really silly for a modern general to say, well, let me study what Alexander the Great or what Julius Caesar were actually doing and try to replicate it. But she said, on the other hand, the human needs, the demographic variability and pressures, the economic pressures and all that sort of stuff that the Romans had to deal with are actually not that different from the ones that we deal with in a multicultural, increasingly multinational society. So I still think that there is quite a bit to be learned from it. But my basic point was simply that the ancient Romans, who, by the way, established the kind of law that is in fact at the basis of much modern legislation. The modern concept of law is in fact directly derived from the Roman concept of law. So you're right. We want to be more specific and all that, but I don't think that there is a contradiction in between saying, look, we need some kind of universal laws, and they will have to be as specific or as permissive or non-permissive as we decide them to be at the societal level. That's fine, but those are laws. Those are not morality. Those are not moral systems.
Yeah.
Of course, there better be a relationship between our moral intuitions and our laws. But those are laws. Laws are supposed to sort of constrain and direct, in a broad sense, people's behaviors. They're not supposed to tell them or to teach them what is right and what is wrong. And so I still think that a dual model, very similar to the ones that the Romans had, that is, there's the law that is equal for everybody, and it's structured in whatever way the society wants to structure and thinks that it's appropriate and useful to structure on the one hand. And then there is ethics as in a bottom-up kind of phenomenon, as in we're going to teach our kids, both in families and at school, about moral development. I mean, one of the things that we've given up in modern education is the idea of moral education. We don't do that. It would be unthinkable to send your kids to school and say, have them, follow a course in sort of virtue ethics or in character building or something like that. But I actually do think that would be a move in the right direction.
Yeah, be careful what you wish for. They actually did start. I mean, they have it around here, maybe not in New York, but they had this thing in middle school called character ed.
Right.
That I really cringed at when I saw what was sort of in it. It seemed to me primarily an exercise in creating obedient people.
Yes, it depends on how it's done. Right. Yes. Yeah. But every good idea, there is a bad version of it. So it does